We're also confident there's some fundamentals that we've got to get to grips with this car in order to fix them on the W16, and we're very busy with that right now, and hopefully making the right changes over the winter so that we're not struggling with these weaknesses next year.
Hello, I'm Olivia, and today I'm joined by Shov, answering all your questions from the Brazilian Grand Prix on this week's Akkodis Debrief. Now, Shov, the triple header done and dusted, ending in probably one of the most chaotic races I've seen in my life. Now, there's only 2 weeks left before the final triple header of the season, so talk us through how the team is feeling going into that.
Well, as you say, it was a tough triple. There was a fair bit of extra work. There were a couple of crashes that we had a bit of damage to recover from. Now, it was nice to get through Brazil with all our parts intact. There were a lot of teams that didn't fare so well, so certainly good job to the drivers keeping out of trouble there. Couple of weeks to prepare for those last 3 races of the year. It does allow us to sort of regroup, get make sure the cars are in good condition heading into those, and we've got 3 very different tracks. So interested to learn more about the car. Hopefully we can get some more podiums before this year is over, but we'll just take this next week or two to analyze the data, get everything ready, and then we can hit those last 3 with everything raring to go.
Yeah, absolutely, and hats off to everyone involved getting the cars ready, especially with that incredibly early start to the weekend. Now, looking back to some of the strategy, with acknowledging hindsight, would you have managed George's tire strategy a bit differently, perhaps even getting to a P2 or even a win?
I think with hindsight, you would manage most races differently, but certainly in this case, we would have done. Now, one of the key things is once they announced the VSC was ending, we had a very, very short window, only a second or 2, where we could have got George to stay out on track. Now, the reason you'd have done that is by that point, you're going to suffer a full pit loss anyway, so you may as well stay out and just gamble on the fact that it was quite likely someone would have a crash, as happened, and that they're forced to red flag it. Prior to that, though, stopping to us made sense because given that Lando was coming in, George was able to do that. He would have still been ahead of all those cars that stayed out, but you get the benefit of fresh rubber in case they don't call it as a red flag. Now, normally, we try not to assume that there's going to be a red flag because sometimes you get it right, sometimes you get it wrong. If there's a safety car and you decide to stay out assuming a red flag, if you don't get it, you're in trouble. But obviously the cars here that did stay out, that gamble worked for them and they ended up in prime position.
Now, what was going on with the brakes and how much did this affect the race pace, as we heard both drivers complaining about it?
We had issues with the brakes, and George was talking about this. He said it felt like the brake disc had warped. Now, with carbon brakes, they don't warp. They're generally pretty planar and you don't get those issues, but you can get peculiar things happening on the surface that means you have higher friction in some areas. That can then create a vibration, and that vibration they can feel through the pedal. So to them it feels like the discs aren't round, but almost always when you check them they are. Now, why was that? Well, we're not quite sure, and that's what we're investigating now. So those brake discs have come back to the factory so we can have a look at them. One factor was they were running quite cold. This was in the wet conditions. So as we were into that race without any prolonged wet running, we had to estimate where the temperatures would be. Now, it may be that those very cold temperatures on the carbon was causing an issue, so we'll look at that. But in the dry, they were absolutely fine. So there's a bit for us to investigate and understand. Hearing other drivers' comments, we weren't the only ones who were struggling with either brake vibration or grabbing, and George felt that it was costing him 2, maybe even 3 tenths a lap, just from that uncertainty of whether or not they're going to lock or whether they're going to vibrate going into the big braking zones.
Now, Lewis in particular was struggling with the car this weekend, but generally, how challenging is it to set up a car that suits both drivers' demands?
I mean, normally you're able to do it. You let the drivers deviate with the setup. They don't have to run the same, and we'll let them evolve their own setup. And when one of them appears to be going well, you often take elements of that setup or even the whole lot and put it onto the other car. Now, it's fair to say Lewis was struggling predominantly with a lack of rear grip. If we look at how he'd set up his car, it's not obvious where that was coming from. But in the sprint race, for instance, as soon as you've got less grip and you're getting the snaps of oversteer on exit, you generate more temperature, and that in itself will prolong the problem. So as with any race, we spend a lot of time digging into the data, trying to understand it, and Lewis's engineering crew will be working with him on this issue, trying to make sure we get to the bottom of it ahead of Vegas. Now, the other factor with the weekend was the conditions were very different. Sprint quali, sprint race, that was in the dry, it was very hot, and then main quali, main race in the wet. So you didn't have the session after session to iterate the setup and understand how to get the most out of the car. So again, that isn't the reason for the issue, but was certainly something that made it more difficult for him to get the setup that he wanted on for the race.
And now, what was the process of thinking behind adjusting the tire pressure while we were out on the grid, and what was the penalty that we ended up taking for that?
Well, the issue was when we got the message for the restart, that was straight into a 10 minutes to go. Now, the tyres must be fitted to the car at 5 minutes to go, and that meant that we only had a few minutes to get the tyres down to the car, get them on the car, and to get them checked by the FIA. Now, that didn't fit, and in Brazil it's an unusual pit lane layout. The garages are up high. You've got to go down either right round the pit entry road, or there's a gate much further up. But with the position of our garage, we had to get the tyre set quite a long way to make it to the car. And then the added complication was that the set that we called for, which was not the set on the racks, but a set on on wheelie boards so we could move them, hadn't been bled down to race pressures at that point. So the engineers will be calling for different tyre pressures. The tyre technicians are then running around trying to make sure all the sets are done, and these sets weren't done. So once we got them down to the car, we were up against that 5-minute limit, which is a serious penalty if you don't make that. We had to then get them on the car. We then started to bleed them, but ran out of time. But the penalty was actually because we didn't have time for the FIA checks to be done. So they were happy that the tyres were at the right pressure. It was simply that the scrutineer wasn't there supervising the bleed before they went on the car, and that was why we were then called to the stewards.
Understood. And do we know what the penalty that we got is?
Well, the penalty was a $5,000 fine per car, so $10,000. But as they accepted, there was no sporting gain from it, that we were complying with all the regulations around tyre pressures. That was only given for a procedural issue, with a mitigating factor that there wasn't the time available to get them down there and get the checks done before they had to be fitted.
Now, on to the upgrades. Was the Coda upgrade performing as expected on the sprint race weekend and into a very rainy race?
So on the upgrades, in terms of what we've measured, we're seeing the load that we expected, and we're seeing it where we expect to see it in terms of, the ride height range. So that is all okay. Here you've got very different conditions, and we saw that at times the car was quite competitive, perhaps most so with George in qualifying, where he was able to get on the front row, but also in that first stint it was working quite well in the wet. Now, we haven't had such good performance in the dry, but the issues that we're struggling with this update, a lot of those are the same as the ones we were struggling with before. And where we tend to be weak, it's in the slow speed corners, particularly the ones where you've got one corner following into another. There's a lot of turning of the car, and that's a weakness that we need to work on. Now, we didn't expect this update kit to improve that. All we expected was this to just lift the base performance of the car. So in terms of what we've seen, yes, we're confident it is doing what was expected. However, we're also confident there's some fundamentals that we've got to get to grips with this car in order to fix them on the W16, and we're very busy with that right now, and hopefully making the right changes over the winter so that we're not struggling with these weaknesses next year.
Yeah, well, actually, onto the W16. This one actually starts off with a huge shout out to everyone who's a part of this triple header. Although it wasn't the result that we expected, what learnings are you taking into the development of the W16 of the 2025 car, and how is the team going to recover and prepare for the rest of this season?
Well, as I said, the main thing in terms of learning is that the corners that we're weak in are still the same ones. It's the interconnected slow corners. That is normally where we trip up. And going into this weekend, we certainly had Sector 2 in Brazil, which has a lot of those corners on our radar as an area that we might struggle. So the big focus on these remaining races for us is learning what we can. We're in a position in the championship where we can't challenge in front of us. It's very unlikely we're going to see any challenge from behind. So our focus has very much shifted to learning what we need to this year to apply to next year in order to get on top of those issues. Now, Brazil, it was useful having that wet running because you want to get a read on the car in the wet. There's always a few wet quali and race sessions over the year. And it was reassuring to see that the pace in those conditions was decent. But we're going to be looking at all the remaining tracks to, again, assess performance and just confirm what we understand about this car and whether the changes we're hoping to make for next year are going to improve those areas. Now, Vegas has a lot of straight line and low speed corners. Qatar is a faster track, and then finishing in Abu Dhabi, which is a mix of everything. It'll give us a good read on how we're performing and who is the benchmark. Sometimes it's Red Bull, sometimes McLaren, sometimes Ferrari, but to allow us to establish the gap that we need to close down over those winter months.